Okay. Turn to Genesis chapter 13 tonight. I'd like to read this a little later on, but I want to talk to you tonight about decisions. Something that we take for granted, something that we perform in our minds constantly, incessantly. We make decisions from the moment we wake up, whether to put the sock on the left foot first, the right foot first. We make decisions throughout the day. We make decisions about what car we're going to buy or what article of clothing we like to wear. Most of our decisions that we make are of little or no importance and are really no great consequence. But occasionally, decisions do confront us because of circumstances which have far-reaching consequences. And I want to talk about that tonight. I say far-reaching because there are certain things that we must decide on. They're different for each one of us, but they will affect what kind of life we're going to live. They will affect us throughout our lives, and we're going to find out tonight that they're going to affect us in eternity, in the time to come, when we meet our Lord. So we take all the information when we make a decision. We balance things out. This is what decision is. Our mind is very complex, and we weigh out information. We think of the pros, and we think of the cons, and we come up with some sort of conclusion, and we act upon that. Occasionally we come across a decision that takes a lot of thought, and if we don't think enough about it, if we don't make the right decision, it could be devastating for us. There is a law that God has instituted when He created this world, just like He made physical laws, laws of physics. There are certain spiritual laws which seem to match those in the physical realm. They can't be broken. Just as if I jump from a building, I'm going to go down. There's no way, there's no exception to that. Stay with me in Genesis, but I'm going to read to you from Galatians 6, verses 7 and 8, this law. And I'd like to use this as a basis for the message tonight. It begins with, "Be not deceived. Don't be fooled. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. But he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting." Men live their lives from day to day unaware of this. Many people do. They have a vague idea of reaping the consequences of their actions. But most unsaved have no idea about this. They can only see what's going to happen now. They don't know there's a God up there who is going to make each one of us accountable for our actions. Whatever you sow, whatever you do, you're going to reap the results of it. There's a physical law that says for every action, there's an opposite, an equal reaction. That's exactly what takes place here. For every action that we perform, there is a reaction, opposite and equal. Why do you suppose that the punishment God laid down for sin is eternal? We must suffer in the lake of fire forever and ever and ever without end. Why is it that the only cure for sin is the sacrifice of the almighty, eternal, infinite God? It's because sin, unbeknownst to many people, is infinitely wrong. We take it far too lightly. It's wrong to such an extent that when we perform sin, we must reap an infinite punishment for that. God is not mocked. It'll happen. But I want to zero in on the Christian tonight, because we're going to have to live with those decisions that we make now and in the future. And the point I want to make tonight, and what we'll probably discover, is that good choices are not necessarily that which pleases me the most at the time. We come across a situation and say, well, this is what I like to do, this is what I want, this is going to please me the most, therefore that's the most logical thing, I'll choose that. That's not necessarily a good choice, as we're going to find out from the example of Abraham and Lot. Both of these men in a crucial time of their life had to make a choice. Most people act on that. They say, well, whatever pleases me the most at the time. They don't look, and they're not aware of this unbreakable law of God, and so they act on that. Abraham and Lot were, let's take the application from their lives. We'll say that there are two believers of the New Testament. Both are saved men, both of the same background, of the same stock, of the same environment, justified, godly men, quite strong in their faith, wanting to serve the Lord, devoted to the Lord, and they're called out. As God called Abraham out of the Ur of the Chaldees into a place where he knew not. And he went by faith, and Lot went with him. They were both called out, as a Christian is. But if you're familiar with the story, we're going to find out that at the end of it all, there's quite a contrast. There's quite a difference. Lot was punished severely, and his life was not a pleasant one. Abraham was blessed beyond measure. Why? What's the difference? What happened? First thing you're going to say is, well, Lot was, he backslid, he's a sinner, he went away from the Lord. Well, that may be true in partially, but I feel that this is due not to a sin per se, but rather to a poor decision on his part. Both confronted a major decision in their lives, and the outcome of that decision was going to ultimately control their destinies, both now and the hereafter. And I feel that we all come to this place in our lives where we have to make a decision, a major decision, that involves how we're going to live. Now again, it's not a sin. These choices, some of these choices are not a matter of right and wrong. They're a matter of what's good and what's best. Let's look at Genesis 13. Let's read the first 13 verses so we'll get the idea of the situation. In verses 1 through 7, we have the circumstances of this decision. We have the proposition in verses 8 and 9, and then we have the decision made in verses 10 through 13. And Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, unto the Negev. And Abraham was very rich in cattle and silver and in gold. And he went on his journeys from the Negev unto Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Hai, unto the place of the altar which he had made there at the first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. And Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. And the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together. For their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. And there was a strife between the herdsmen of Abram's cattle and the herdsmen of Lot's cattle. And the Canaanite and Pezerite dwelt then in the land, or Perizzite. And Abraham said unto Lot, Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdsmen and thy herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. If thou wilt depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan. And Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent towards Sodom. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. So we have the circumstances leading up to this. There are circumstances in our lives, obviously they're much different than what we have here. We can't control a lot of these things, but we can control how we react to them and the choices that we make in light of them. There's no pat answers. I can't tell you what to decide. The situation is so different in every case. Each one has to be considered on its own, and all the information has to be weighed and balanced before you make a decision. And the point I want to make tonight is that we must weigh all the information, all of it. And we can make a great mistake if we only look at on one side of things. We must be very careful, especially about decisions such as this. The proposition was made by Abram in verse 8 and 9. He said, we must now decide. We're going to have to make a decision here, Lot. And it's an important one. And the decision involved where and how they were to live their lives, the rest of their lives. Where are you going to live your life, Lot? Where do you want to live? And what style of life do you choose to have? They were at a crossroads in their lives. And this particular crossroad happened here, and I believe it happens to each one of us at some point in our lives. There's a crossroads, and we have to make a decision. But I warn you, we have to be very careful how we decide, because the consequences can be very grave. And the decision that Lot made in verse 10 and 11 and 12, notice, he looked up and he said, okay, he's going to weigh out the information that's before him. What's the best choice? He looked over and he saw that over in the east the land was beautiful. It was well watered, good for his cattle, great land. I could really prosper there. And it was beautiful. It was like the garden of the Lord. It was like the land of Egypt. It was wonderful. So he said, okay, I'm going to choose that. And it says in verse 12 that Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent towards Sodom. Now the problem is here that since it's such a beautiful place, that others had, of course, had the same idea. And there was two great cities in that same area, because everyone else had the same idea. It was a land of plenty. It reminded me of California. That's why everybody flocks to California, because it's so beautiful. The problem is that there's things go on there that are not quite pleasing to the Lord. And so he went there. He pitched his tent towards Sodom. Now that was a mistake, I feel. He made a decision. Everything was really good. He thought to himself, okay, this is what's going to please me the most. I can see that. But I think that he was very, very short-sighted. I don't think that he weighed properly all the information. And it's a big mistake that a lot of believers make today. And it's on a supposition that, a false supposition, that the path of easiest resistance is the best way to go. The path of beauty and of personal gain for yourself and for your family is the best way to go, is the best decision to make. But he never considered the whole situation. He pitched his tent towards Sodom, He chose the world. He chose to be associated with very wicked men. Okay? He saw only the pleasure and the wealth that was there for him, and he knew he could prosper. And so it was a good decision in a way, wasn't it? It seems good on the surface. Very good. But he didn't consider what accompanies this type of lifestyle. There's more to it than that. Perhaps we can illustrate this best by an example. Now again, let me emphasize, we're not talking about right and wrong. We're not talking about sin. Okay? We're talking about making a decision. It wasn't wrong for Lot to choose that. It wasn't a sin in itself. Let's say a man has to make a decision, a believer, and he thinks, well, I have this job offer in a big city, high pay, which is good. There's nothing wrong with that. The Lord has used men greatly in those positions, and he says, well, I'm going to have an executive lifestyle. I'm going to live very well, and there's nothing wrong with living very well. My family's going to be well cared for, well provided for, and it's going to be really good. But I wonder if we realize the things that perhaps might go along with that. Do you ever consider that further on down the road that this type of lifestyle might cause you to compromise your position as a Christian because of the pressures of the society in which you choose to live in? Perhaps you're going to end up committing your time and yourself to your job or the situation you live in, and less of the Lord. Perhaps the influences of this lifestyle is not a good one. Morally poor upon your family and upon yourself. Perhaps the temptations of materialism might become chronic. Perhaps there's going to be a breakdown of your family. Perhaps you can lose control of your children because they're lured. You may be strong in your faith, but perhaps they're going to be lured into a wicked life as they see this is their environment, and they may choose that. Perhaps there's going to be a spiritual decay. We live in the world, and I'm not saying that we should live as hermits, but at the same time, it says in 1 Corinthians 15:33 that, again, be not deceived. Evil company corrupts good morals. Again, that's another law of the Lord that cannot be broken. We have to consider those things. Once again, we're not talking about sin. We're not talking about right and wrong. Perhaps Lot chose second best. Perhaps he didn't weigh all the information and balance it out. So he pitched his tent. He set his heart and his eyes towards Sodom. Let's take a look at the consequences that came out of this decision. Seemed like a good one at the time, but because of those things that I just mentioned, because of the influences, because of the style of life that he chose, things began to deteriorate for Lot rather quickly. And from this time on, there's incident after incident where Lot gets himself into trouble. In chapter 14, verse 11 and 12, the first thing that happens is that there's a bit of a war. It says, and they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food supplies and went their way. And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. Okay? Everyone else wants what you have. Okay? And Lot was in danger of losing it, and he did at one point, and Abram had to bail him out, so to speak. And another incident rose, another one, and another one, and it finally came to a head down in chapter 19 when the the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah was so great that God could not hold off judgment any longer. And notice, Lot is in the crossfires. He's right in the middle of it. He chose to live there, and he himself was in danger. Even though the Lord was still first to him, and he endeavored to serve the Lord, but he was there in this wicked environment. But hold here in chapter 19. I want to take a look in 2 Peter for a moment to show you how that decision had affected Lot's life. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 7 and 8. Speaking of the judgment of the Lord here in 2 Peter 2. It says in verse 7, and delivered just Lot. God did. Vexed. Lot was vexed with the filthy manner of life of the wicked. It vexed him. He had to live with that his whole life long. We as believers might choose what is good and what is most profitable from a physical point of view. But don't forget, you have to live with that decision. Verse 8 says, for that righteous man, dwelling among them, in seeing and hearing, vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deeds. And he got caught in the crossfire. And lastly, in chapter 19, probably the greatest heartache for Lot because of this decision was his family. He may have been strong. He may have kept on the narrow for the Lord. But why did he subject his family to such a lifestyle? Why did he subject boys and girls who are very weak and impressionable to this environment, wicked, vile place? And he had to pay for it. We all know the story of chapter 19, how the angels had come to Abram and said they were going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah for the wickedness. The angels came to Lot in Sodom. In verse 1 of chapter 19, and there came two angels to Sodom at evening, and Lot sat in the gate of Sodom. And Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them. Okay, apparently Lot, because of the lifestyle that he chose, he became very prominent in that particular city. He became somewhat of a leader because of what we see here, that he sat in the gate of Sodom. Okay, and he had a position of esteem. He was very, very rich and influential. And it's a terrible thing that happens here. There's a terrible account of the wicked men as they called out for the angels to come unto them, and how Lot had to offer his own daughters so that these wicked men would not do such a terrible thing. And it broke his heart to do it, I'm sure. But notice, after the angels had warned them, verse 12 of chapter 19, and the men said unto Lot, hast thou here any besides, son-in-law, and thy daughters, and whatsoever thou hast in the city, bring them out of this place, for we will destroy this place, because the cry of them has become great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. And Lot went out and spoke unto his sons-in-law, who married his daughters, his children, and said, up, get ye out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city. But he seemed as one that mocked unto his sons-in-law. Crazy old fool, you know. This is their reaction to Lot. They stayed where they were. They wanted no part of it. He lost his family because of it. So finally, he had to leave with his two youngest daughters and his wife, and they fled for their life. He left behind all that he had worked for. Now look at in verse 26. It seems quite apparent that this type of lifestyle had influenced his wife to such an extent that she couldn't leave it. It had affected her. She wanted the prestige, she wanted the riches, she wanted the wealth, and she liked it. And as they fled, his wife looked back, and he recalled the warning of the angels not to look back. And as they looked back, they would be turned into a pillar of salt. And that's what his wife did. She was so involved with her life back there, she couldn't leave it. She had to look back. And it says that in verse 26. Let's take a look now at the long-range results. We see that it affected Lot's whole life through. He was vexed. He had a miserable life, and constantly battling with his children, trying to bring them back. How many times have you seen men and women or parents who are constantly battling with their children because they had chose a particular style of life? Gone into the world, come back. Gone into the world, come back. And they would lose them. But notice the long-term results. And again, let's consider the analogy. For us, we have to live with our decisions, but in the future, there's going to be a time of accounting, the judgment seat of Christ. We're going to have to give account for the decisions that we made, the style of life that we chose. Notice in chapter 19, verse 30 and through 32, it says, "And Lot went out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountain, and his 2 daughters with him, for he feared to dwell in Zoar, and he dwelt in a cave, he and his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said unto the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man in the earth to come in unto us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father." And then down in verse 36, "Thus were both the daughters of Lot with child by their father. And the firstborn bore a son, and called his name Moab. Same is the father of the Moabites unto this day. And the younger, she also bore a son, and called his name Ben-Ammi. The same as the father of the children of Ammon unto this day." His daughters had accepted the standard of life and the only environment they knew of. And when they left that, that's all they knew. And they conspired to do this terrible thing. And the results were that the 2 children that were born, ironically, became the fathers of 2 nations, which were enemies and which were thorns in the side of the children of Israel for quite a long time. And here we have Lot living in a cave. No home, no prestige, no high-ranking position, no money, no wife, children who were corrupt. But in contrast, we look at Abraham, because he chose properly. The Lord blessed him beyond any other man. In chapter 11 of Hebrews, we found out that Abraham looked beyond the immediate situation, and he considered the long-term effects of his decisions. He put everything in the proper perspective, and that's the key, the proper perspective. And that the proper perspective is spiritual and is from the eternal point of view. We think too much of our time here on earth and not enough of the eternal consequences of it. In Hebrews 11, verse 8, By faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out not knowing where he went. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs of him of the same promise. Verse 10, for he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. That's where Abraham's mind was. That's the other side of the scales that Abraham considered. He wasn't looking at the wonderful city of Sodom and Gomorrah and all the wealth and the beauty that he could enjoy in this life. He was willing to sacrifice that because he was looking at a city that was even greater. It was the city of God. Let's take a look at the believer for a moment. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. What does this mean to us? What lesson can we learn from it? As I said, there's going to be a reckoning someday. We're going to be accountable for our actions. We're going to be accountable for our decisions that we make. And the end of Lot's life perfectly typifies what's going to happen to us. Both Abraham and Lot, they labored pretty hard, didn't they? But what did they have to show at the end of their lives for their earthly labors? Abraham had to show a lot. Lot had to show nothing. There he was, by himself, cold, naked, destitute. He lived in a cave. He lost all his possessions, his wealth, his prestige, back there in Sodom. It all went up in smoke. It was burned. Lot had to reap the consequences of that. He reaped what he sowed. Here in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, let's read verses 12 through 15. Now if any man build upon this foundation gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, stubble, every man's work shall be made manifest. For the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire. And the fire shall test every man's work of what sort it is. If any man's work abide, which he has built upon it, he shall receive a reward. If any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss. But he himself shall be saved, yet as by fire. And in God's eyes, the hard work that Lot performed on this earth was purposeless, was vain. It was transitory. It was for himself. He chose to live good, to live well on the earth. It didn't do him any good, because all that passed away. All that we worked for on the earth is going to pass away. We can't take our money with us. We can't take our earthly honor and prestige with us. First of all, he was sitting in the gate of Sodom, and next he was sitting in a cave. He couldn't take his possessions with him. They were all destroyed. They were burned up, poof, in a great fervent heat. It's exactly what's going to happen to our works. It perfectly typifies the judgment seat of Christ. Okay? All the works that Abraham performed, he received reward for it. But the works that Lot performed, they were burned up because they were of wood, hay, and stubble. They were earthly, transitory. When Lot fled, all he worked for went up in smoke. His house, he lost his family, his wife, his glory, his honor, his money, his possessions. And notice especially verse 15. If any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet as by fire. That's exactly the situation that happened. There was Lot. His life was spared. Okay? And it really typifies what happens to the believer. We're going to be spared. He didn't get destroyed in the judgment, because he was a believer, and God spared him. He was a just man, but all he worked for was going up in smoke. And I'm afraid this can happen to many of us if we make the wrong decision. And so if you come to that crossroad in your life, or if you have come to it, or if you are in it, I hope that you will weigh out the information. Again, I'm not saying that to be wealthy or to live in the world is wrong. It isn't. But everyone's situation is different, and I can't tell you what to do. I can only tell you that your decision concerning how you live must be weighed and properly balanced by not only the good that's for us here now, but what about the long range effects? Okay? Let's consider the spiritual, the heavenly side, and the eternal side of the decisions that we make. Let's close in prayer.